Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Moving out.
Welcome back to the program. A little moving out music there from Billy Joel as we look at the movement of millions of human beings around the planet. It's the Law Show here on CIL 650. A real pleasure to have Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kischer from Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic, immigration and citizenship lawyers in Vancouver, back with us on the program this morning. Couldn't be a better time for this discussion, gentlemen, as literally the whole world is involved in this discussion. And we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers. And Gordon, before we get to how Canadian groups of 5 or more can arrange to help out the process and be sponsors and what obligations they'd be required to assume, let's talk about asylum a little bit more and where Canada ranks among asylum granting countries around the world, because we tend to think of ourselves as wealthy and generous. So how do we stack up?
We talked earlier about the resettlement figures.
Yes.
In Canada, Australia, and the U.S. take in 90% of resettled refugees, but that's a small number, 100,000 a year.
Okay.
That still leaves nearly 20 million displaced people out there looking for protection. They're not resettled by the UNHCR. What are they doing? They're going to countries and they're seeking protection by seeking asylum in those countries. Where are those people right now? Most of them are in Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia. These are countries. Turkey has 1.6 million displaced persons in its borders. Pakistan has 1.5 million. Lebanon, 1 million. These are people, and now Turkey, Pakistan, and Lebanon cannot support these people.
Right, and then you look at Greece and all those people ending up on the beaches, and they're flat broke to begin with. They can't be much help to anybody.
And where are they heading? Where are those people heading? They're heading to the European countries.
Right.
Countries who are signatories to the Convention on Refugees.
Germany, Austria, Sweden, and so on.
When they get to those countries, they will make their refugee claim. That is what they hope.
Right.
And those countries will determine their claim and decide whether or not to retain them and give them protection. That's the goal of those people. How many of those people are there out there? Well, in 2013, Germany had over 100,000 refugee claims in its borders.
Okay.
Sweden had about 54,000. The United States had 84,000. Australia had 24,000. Canada in 2013 had 10,000 claims. 10,000.
That's not very much for
this year. 2014, they had 13,000.
Again, though, we do pride ourselves on being wealthy and generous, and perhaps deluding ourselves in the process, because those numbers, and I'm looking at the 10-to-1 ratio. If the United States had 84,000, well, then I suppose we should have 8,400, and we're over that number. So on that Canada-U.S. comparison, we're still okay.
We are actually ranked 26th in the world in terms of our refugee claims within our borders, whereas the U.S. is 27th.
Okay.
So, yes, we beat the heck out of the U.S.
Right.
in Canada determinations. Sweden, on the other hand, ranks first, Germany ninth.
Right.
But, I mean, to go back to that point, but it would make sense that we would have a low number of claimants, given the fact that we only border with one country, the United States, that doesn't produce refugees.
Right.
There's never been there's been one recognized U.S. refugee, and that was overturned by the federal court. So generally, the United States does not create refugees, and we have an agreement with them to turn back that a refugee should make a claim in the U.S. if they come through the United States.
Okay.
So it makes sense that we have a small number of refugees. But what I think, and I think what Gordon's getting to is that, in terms of our resettlement program, while it's, maybe robust in terms of compared to other resettlement programs worldwide, we're not really maybe doing our part, right?
Okay.
That's right. In total numbers, we actually rank quite low.
Right. Let me bring up the example that everyone listening can still clearly remember, because it happened right here on our doorstep. We're back in the 70s. It's the boat people from Vietnam who arrive on our shores, uninvited, undocumented. Nobody's carrying passports or visas or even money in many cases. They show up, and we say, well, come on in. So what's different about that era, Rudy, and 2015, when we ostensibly could be showing the same treatment to an equal number of people, but again, this time from the other side of the world?
Well, there's a...
the boat would be in Halifax this time, not Vancouver.
The boat would be in Halifax. The people, I think it's important to remember, the Vietnamese people that arrived here didn't arrive like the Sun Sea or the Chinese migrants that arrived. The Sun Sea is now 5 years ago, where the people coming from... is it 10 years ago?
My goodness.
Yeah, 10 years ago, and the Chinese migrants are 15 years ago, I guess, in terms of arriving at our shore on a boat. The way the Indo-Chinese, the Vietnamese arrived, they were selected by Canada from camps. So Canada sent over officers.
Oh, so we knew who they were.
So we went into the camps, and
it was 5 years ago.
It was 5 years ago. Since he was 5 years ago.
So,
2010.
So they went into the camp. So a Canadian officer would go into the camp, would conduct an interview, and decide that, okay, but we had a special program. So the government, in cases, they did the same thing in Kosovo. They did the same thing with the Vietnamese. They did the same thing with the Hungarians in the 50s.
Right, sure.
Okay? So we sent people overseas. We had the manpower to do it. Gordon might want to comment on that later. And people went into the camps, interviewed people, and then selected those people and said, okay, we're going to take you. But the government set up a special program. The Conservative government hasn't done that yet.
So they weren't a surprise. The boat people weren't as much of a surprise as many of us assumed they were.
Yeah.
We had gone over it. We knew who each and every one of these people were, albeit they did arrive in somewhat extraordinary circumstances.
But
we're here.
The process was done in a timely fashion. It was done fast. And I think it's important. You asked me earlier about the cost of refugees.
Yes.
There's a great study out of SFU by a guy named Dvoritz who studied the Indo-Chinese, the Vietnamese that arrived in the 1980s and studied them for something like 25 years. And at the end of the 25 years, what he found is that they were contributors in tax dollars. If you looked at the services that were taken to sort of resettle them, get them up to speed in English,
the investment we made up front,
they returned that in more than enough, right? In terms of actually paying more taxes than they actually took out of it. So they were next tax contributors. You know, I mean, those are people that are thankful to be here. And if you listen to refugees, people that have come through this program, and we resettled about 600 out of Hong Kong. You know, they are thankful every day to Canada and have respect for you know our democracy, our system, our laws, and the generosity of our people, right? So I think they're a great contribution that way.
And I think it's very instrumental too, or instructive, let's say, to compare how we dealt with the boat people from Vietnam and how we dealt with the Ocean Lady and Sun Sea in 2010. That's very relevant to how we've arrived where we are today.
Compare the two, if you would, Gordon, so
Sure.
to our benefit here, so we can understand how the lesson learned might be applied in a new context.
Certainly. Remember that the Ocean Lady and Sun Sea were arrivals of 70 persons on board a boat and 450 persons on board a vessel, both arriving on the West Coast.
Right.
The response of the government of the day, and this was in 2010, was to use maximum enforcement procedure in the determination of those claims. So everybody was placed under detention.
Right, I remember that.
And officers were given strict direction to proceed with detention and to argue for continued detention as much as possible throughout the process so that claims would be made while from detention. The aim was to be a deterrent against future arrivals and to diminish the prospect of granting refugee status to these individuals. And remember how these persons were labeled. Publicly, they were derided as being either terrorists, frauds, queue jumpers.
Mm-hmm. I remember the queue jumper stuff very clearly.
Criminals, you know. In fact, not one of them has been deported for any of those reasons.
Interesting.
Not one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think it was telling. So you know, you take a look at the response to Germany. These refugees are arriving, and some people are lining up to greet them and saying with signs, "We want refugees." When the Chinese boats arrived back in the late 1990s, I'll never forget it. We had about 600 people arrived, and the people were send them home. The articles were, you know, don't let them in, except there was a white dog. I don't know if you remember, there was a white dog on that boat. And they had something like 300 requests to take the dog.
Oh, really?
And I thought, what a sad day for Canada.
No kidding.
You know, you have two boats of people arriving, seeking asylum, have a story to tell, and Canada didn't even want to hear the story. It was like, send them home.
And the legacy from the Sun Sea and Ocean Lady is that Canada has enacted several changes to the refugee process.
Right.
One of which was to expeditiously process all refugee claims, just a much higher time scale involved. So refugee claims are now done in a matter of 3 months total, and they can be faster. They also enacted legislation, the designated arrivals legislation. If people come to Canada without using a proper airline, if they come by boat, if they come by vehicle, if they use a human smuggler, they can be a designated arrival, and there's mandatory detention.
Okay.
They are given one review after 7 days in which they have to satisfy the government who they are and that they're admissible. If they don't meet that test after 7 days, then they don't have another review for 6 months.
One of the concerns that is being expressed by people all over the world of this current group, this exodus from the Middle East, mostly Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and certainly our government feeds into this as well, are security issues. They're talking about the exporting of malcontents on a good day, terrorists on a bad day, who will come and just join the crowd and just blend in and make their way to these free countries and Western democracies in Europe and so on. And so the Prime Minister of Great Britain said, okay, look, under great pressure from his European colleagues to take in more refugees, said, fine, we'll take in 25,000. But we're going to do, as the Canadians, it turns out, did with the boat people, Rudy, we're going to go to the camps and we're going to take 25,000 people with papers. So we know who they are, so they're pre-screened. So even if there are security risks in that group, we'll be able to follow them and we'll be able to identify them from the get-go.
I think you're missing that there's an additional step there that maybe most listeners don't realize is when UNHCR designates somebody as a refugee, they don't have the money or the wherewithal to do any sort of security checks.
Of course.
So that the Canadian government still does that, right? So every name, anybody who's even under this designated, so what they did with the Vietnamese refugees and what they're doing right now is all those names are sent to CSIS. Right, so the Canadian Intelligence Service does that, or the RCMP does a background check on each one of them, right? And I don't think anybody's advocating that we shouldn't do it, right? But the question is, how fast do you do it, and how much of a priority do you make it, right? And that seems to be the problem, right? And I think we're living in a different era in terms of it's post 9/11. Right? So the last massive resettlement programs where we had designated countries such as Kosovo and Vietnam, 9/11 hadn't happened.
That's right.
And if you look at the tragedies of this year in which the soldier was attacked, right, in Ottawa, and the other gentleman, the other soldier that was run over, we've had direct attacks from groups linked from that region on our own soil.
Yes.
We never had that. I mean, there was still a communist fear with the Vietnamese. There was a fear of communists, some sort of, somehow getting in. But at the end of the day, I think that this time is a little bit different, but I think it can be addressed.
It can be addressed by targeting who your audience is going to be for selection. If you focus on young families with children, they are less likely to be a security risk.
Right.
If you target families with children who have direct Canadian relations, they are less likely to be security risks.
Right.
So there's ways of minimizing the risk. Is there risk? Yes.
Of course.
Is it enough to completely unbalance the need to provide a humanitarian solution? That's a good question. You got to find ways to make that balance.
And I think one of the things that, in praise of the Harper Government, I think one of the smart moves is they talked about sort of targeting minorities, right? Whether they be religious minorities or cultural minorities that have been the subject of attacks by either ISIS or the Assad regime. That got a lot of backlash in the media saying, well, that we really should be open to all nations or all religions. And I don't think that's what the Harper government was saying, but it helps remove the slowdown on that security issue if you're bringing somebody from a group who you're not going to have those security concerns with, right?
Right. We didn't get around to dealing with what commitments individual Canadians or groups of 5 Canadians or more need to make should they want to become actively involved in the sponsorship of a refugee to this country. And we'll deal with that in our next segment. And also some comments. I keep referring to the fact that, we fancy ourselves to be wealthy and generous, and we are. But how? How much generosity is there? There's no shortage of wealth, but how generous are we really? And that, of course, is our generosity is expressed by our government and our rules with respect to international commerce and, in this case, the movement of human beings. And so we've had various political statements made during this colorful election campaign. And so here we are trying to sort it all out and make some sense of it and perhaps even vote for somebody who represents in some small way how we feel about this matter. So we'll talk about some of the political statements being made and certainly what Canadians and individual and small groups of Canadians can do to assist in this refugee crisis that is global and very, very current. It's The Law Show on CIL 650. Lots more still ahead. Stay with us.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.